Welcome everybody to our webinar on the topic of cookies, new guidance, best practices, and better user experiences. So I'm Fergal McHugh, and I'm head of strategy at Arekibo, and we're running this webinar in association with OneTrust, who really have kind of pioneered the delivery of solutions in the domain of digital privacy and governance. Recently, we were just talking about it before we came on here, Inc. magazine has named them the fastest growing company in the US. And I think this is important, not just because it's obviously a credit to the work they're doing as a company, but it just tells us how important issues of privacy and data governance have become, how important these are in the digital sphere. So our topic today, cookies. Well, cookies are a topic of considerable interest right now. I think not least with this looming stay of execution on enforcement by the DPC. And I think that, most of the people who are kind of tuning in today are aware of kind of the background. There's been a string of court cases in Europe, and new guidance from the DPC has brought out a kind of new clarity on what our cookie obligations are. And now, and the time has come to address them. If you're not aware of this new guidance, obviously have a look at the DPC website where they're providing it. And of course, on our website, we have a bunch of articles that talk about what people need to do. So I think, like a great many topics, cookies are cookie and cookies compliance. It's both very simple, and it's actually quite complex. In terms of the complex bit, I'm hoping that everybody will be just a little bit clearer on what they need to do at the end of the session. But in terms of the simplicity bit, well, there's a kind of a straightforward sense in that this is legislation that's actually been around for quite a while, and our job is to get compliant with it. But I think it's also important to recognize that, in a lot of cases, getting compliant is something we want to do. This legislation is about protecting users, and it's an important thing to be involved with. And, I think while a lot of us think that there may be better ways to do this, it's important to kind of, to take the steps to get compliant now and join that conversation about how things can be better, how things can be better in the future. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to have a presentation from Efrain Castaneda, who's a privacy counsel, who's a privacy counsel at OneTrust, and who has expertise in law, technology, privacy, and data protection, which is another way of saying that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to this topic. And he's going to take us through some through this whole world of cookie guidance and best practice and what needs to be done in that area. And then we're going to follow up that presentation with a discussion, not just about compliance of what we need to do in the present, but really maybe open up that discussion into what needs to be done in the future and what will be possible in the future, what it's going to be like for us in a as it were, a post-compliance world. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is just get it started, and I'll hand you over to Efrain. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Fergal, and welcome everyone. Good morning. Indeed, we're going to talk about cookies. In particular, I'm going to focus on the DPC's sweep, the report and the findings after the sweep they undertook last year, and I'm gonna come up with what the guidelines are and what are some best practices around it to be compliant, to be able to be compliant with the way the DPC is interpreting the cookies law, if you want to call it that way. The agenda today is quite simple. I'm gonna give you a brief introduction of who OneTrust is, what we do, and then I'm gonna go straight into the topic, the cookie sweep, the overview of the sweep and the findings. I'm gonna give you some best practices based on the guidance and based on what we do as well. And then we're gonna move on to around 15-20 minutes Q&A with Fergal, and everyone from the audience will be welcome to ask any questions you may have around the topic I'm discussing. So without any further ado, I'm going to start because we don't have too much time. As Fergal said, we are today the world's #1 most widely used platform to manage privacy, security, and trust. We've been out there for a little over 4 years. But I have to say, in just 3 years, we've grown threefold. When I say 2 years, we have north of 5,000 customers. We are 1,500 employees. When I joined the company, we were 500. That was 2 years ago. And a lot of us are involved in product R&D, including the people from the privacy team like myself. So the lawyers, together with the developers, we have all some input to give to the platform so that it does what it's supposed to do to help you all comply with privacy regulations and other standards like ISO and NIST and some other security standards. We have global scalability. We have 10 locations globally, and we support 100 languages on our platform, regardless of whether you're using the template or our data guidance division for knowledge and research. You can find a lot of information around, and we support, as I said, 100 languages. We've been named #1 leader according to the Forrester Wave. This is the second time, the second time we've been named a leader. I'm proud to say that because I'm part of the team that's made that possible. That means the OneTrust team, and in particular, the privacy team. So now, straight to topic, the cookie sweep and the overview of findings. The October deadline, the October 5 deadline for the enforcement of the DPC's guidelines on cookies and other tracking technologies was the result of a sweep they undertook last year. And by tracking technologies, a sweep over tracking technologies on several browsers and I mean websites of several different controllers. By tracking technologies, I mean cookies, of course, but also other types of tracking technologies. Let's not forget that tracking technologies means cookies or flash cookies or beacons or like buttons or pixels, all alike, as long as they are deployed on a user's computer and they follow that user throughout his or her journey on the web. So now the background to this report and to these guidelines is a cookie sweep that commenced in August 2019. The DPC began an examination of the use of cookies and these other technologies across a range of industries, including the media and publishing, restaurants, also sports and leisure, and the public sector. The sweep was carried out in the form of a survey whereby the DPC would get a questionnaire to several controllers that they chose, and with the expectation of getting information back. It was impressive to see that most, if not like over 90% of the controllers surveyed came back with accurate information of what their practices were. So with this, the DPC was able to understand what was problematic across industries, what were they compliant about, and what were they struggling to comply with. And so the regulator took a sample mixing 3 different types of controllers. So on the one hand, they chose the popular websites operated by some of the most well-known organizations across the sectors. You can think of the bigger websites, not browser engines, but websites. Controllers that use cookies that had come to the attention of the DPC because of the way they were using or the types of cookies they were using, or because they got complaints by private actors. And they also chose controllers that had come to the attention of the regulator through their own observations. Let's not forget that regulators can carry out an audit whenever they want, and this audit could be digital or could be on-prem, depending on what they're looking for. And the main focus this time of DPC was not solely consent, but it was around consent. As you may all know, consent is what holds tracking technologies together in the sense that, except a few cases, in the case of Ireland's DPC, only 2 exceptions, we need consent for deploying cookies and other tracking technologies. What the DPC did not do during the sweep was to focus on ad tech vendors or real-time bidding. Real-time bidding is a very interesting scenario. It's a very complex context, and it was out of the scope of this sweep. Which I would like to talk a little more about RTB. This time it's out of the scope of this presentation, but it may come up during our Q&A session with Fergal or with the audience. And as I said, consent is now a GDPR standard. It's not just for the DPC, but that holds across Europe. That means when you drop tracking technologies, you need to get consent from your users. And consent has to follow the standards marked by the GDPR, meaning it has to be freely given, has to be specific, informed, unambiguous, and it has to be as easy to withdraw consent as it was to give consent. Now, just to remind you a little bit about the interplay of several laws here when we regulate or when we talk about cookies. On the one hand, you have the e-privacy directive. That's a pan-European directive that, however, being a directive, it's not directly applicable to member states. That means that member states have to transpose that legislation into their local laws. And that's how regulations, the e-privacy regulations in Ireland, SI number 336 from 2011 came about. The e-privacy regulations in Ireland implement and transpose the e-privacy directive's mandates into Irish law. And they both interact with the GDPR because, well, consent is key for tracking technologies. And the e-privacy directive does not tell us what the elements of consent are or how consent has to be obtained. Therefore, the GDPR has to be taken into account. So, as I said, when we're dropping or deploying tracking technologies, we can only do it if we have obtained the consent of the user, and that has to be clear, specific, and after having provided comprehensive information to users. If a user doesn't understand what they are accepting, then consent most likely is unlawful. And so for them to understand, we have to display information. Information has to be displayed prominently and has to be easily accessible, not just on a pop-up banner on a first visit to the website, but every time I want to know a little more about your cookies practices, then it should be easy for me as a user to just open back up the banner or a preference center where I could read more information about the cookies. And I have to include, without limitation, the purposes for which the information will be processed. Let's remember that for this case, or in general for data protection, purposes cannot be bundled when they are subject to consent. Now, some of the key figures and findings from the DPC, they targeted 40 controllers with the methodology I briefly explained earlier. So controllers that were high profile, or those controllers that had been received complaints against, or those controllers that simply were sparked the curiosity of the regulator. Out of those 40 controllers, 38 respondents. One of the controllers that did not respond, they said they didn't respond because they were waiting for they were revamping their website, so therefore they were going to take into account the guidelines of DPC. There was no user responding about a website that will be phased out or was phased out already. And the second respondent just didn't say anything, and apparently the DPC is considering further action, but I don't know any more about that. Now, from those, 10 of the controllers deployed pre-checked boxes or sliders that are not compliant. That means they went for an opt-out model, whereas in Europe, we have an opt-in model. That means consent first, not legitimate interest. Now, 2/3 of controllers were relying on implied consent or legitimate interest, and just under 1/3 of controllers had already identified improvements they could make. Now, it's safe to say that they seem to have been very wary of their flaws, and some of them even said that, well, despite what we know that we're doing the right thing, there are certain things we don't know what to do about. And well, that's how the DPC came out with a report of this sweep, and then followed by the report came the guidance from the DPC to clarify those aspects that seem to have been problematic from the sample survey that they took. Some of the concerns arising from cookie sweep that we can all read this on the report. You can find the report, as Fergal said, on the DPC's website. You can also go to data guidance. We have plenty of information about anything that's happening on cookies and consent, the latest news on privacy. I strongly suggest you to visit the website. I take a lot of my information from our own data guidance division. So one of the main problems was the use of implied consent. As I showed you, 2/3 of respondents were using implied consent. That means pre-ticked boxes. That's not acceptable. That hasn't been acceptable for a long time in Europe. And although there was a good level of cooperation with this, they were still, so these users, or I mean, these controllers were still at fault on several angles. They had badly designed or barely visible banners with a poor presentation of information, or the information may have been too complicated for the users to understand. Let's keep in mind that when we're communicating with users online, we don't know what our audience is going to be like unless we have a very specific product or service targeted to a very specific age, right? But if that's not the case, we have to think how we are presenting information so that it is understandable for the user, and we don't fall under the badly designed or barely visible bundled information with T's and C's, etc. They were using non-exempt cookies, some of them, including dozens of ad trackers set without consent. And now this was a problem because the regulations, the Irish regulations, indeed, they tell us that the methods for providing information and giving consent should be user-friendly, but also they say that what it is technically possible and effective, the user's consent to the storing of information or gaining access could be achieved through appropriate browser settings. This was somewhat of a confusion because it's not an obligation. It says you could do it. However, it is problematic because that assumes a level of knowledge from a user that the users may not have. And what is technically possible and effective, the user's consent could be gathered with other technological applications by means of which the user can be considered to have given consent in a meaningful way. One example of another way of giving consent is using an external consent management provider, such as OneTrust. Another problem was the lack of clarity on how consent can be withdrawn. As I said, it doesn't matter. You have to let users withdraw consent as easily as it was to give consent. A few months ago, the Spaniards considered implied consent as a lawful model of obtaining consent. That means, continue browsing and you're consenting. That's problematic for various reasons, but on this specific reason, that means withdraw consent as easily as it was to give consent. I can't think of a way in which you can withdraw consent as easily as it was to give it when you were just scrolling down a website, unless, well, if you scroll up, that means you reject consent, but that doesn't really work. Therefore, they made a U-turn right after the EDPB's guidelines on consent 2 months ago. Another problem was the inability for users to reject cookies without going to the browser settings. So now the regulations allow to do that. However, it is not advisable to use only browser settings because, well, one of the problems would be that if I don't have the proper settings, when I go to a website that's dropping cookies and it's relying on browser settings, if I don't know anything about it, and if I don't have appropriate settings according to my privacy preferences, that means that cookies will be deployed before I make any meaningful choice. And another problem was the nudging of users. So interfaces were designed to nudge users into accepting cookies. So, for example, having a massive "OK, got it," which means in a way accept all cookies and only that button, or having a massive accept all cookies and a barely visible reject all or no more or give me more information button. That's not acceptable pretty much anywhere in the 28, soon to be 27 member states in the EU. And well, that's not all, obviously. There's more. There were loads of advertising trackers on health-related websites, which make things slightly more complicated because, as we know, health-related information is a special category of data, right? So we have to follow different rules, and we have to be even more strict with consent. There was inadequate information about the tracking technologies. Many actors didn't, and I still see that happening on a regular basis within and without Ireland. A lot of controllers just do not mention any other type of tracking technologies besides cookies. There are more tracking technologies, and some of them may be even a little nefarious in the way they're invisible, for example, right? So pixels that we can't see, we don't know they exist, they may be funneling information. So when we consent, if there is no information about those pixels or about the Facebook like button, for example, that follows you across your journey, even without you liking anything on a website, that means we have to think of those other technologies, and we have to explain to the user what they do and how information is processed by those technologies. Other problem was the lifespan of cookies, 100 years and longer. There is no real reason to have a cookie to last 100 years. And well, in the case of the DPCs, they recalibrated the lifespan of a cookie. And a consent cookie, for example, can have a lifespan of up to 6 months, but then you have to ask for consent again, or you have to remind the user again to check your settings or check your preferences, because you may have changed your mind. Some lack of awareness about joint controllership issues, and they were, in fact, one of the respondents said that they were waiting for the Fashion ID sentence to come out from the ECJ. That was obviously last year. So that they were clear on what and to what extent we become joint controllers when we embed pixels or like buttons from third parties. So to an extent, we can and we are all liable to becoming joint controllers with these other organizations to the extent that we define some of the purposes and the means of processing, but they also do the same. And there is another thing was confusion between the e-privacy regulations in Ireland and their analogy to the e-privacy directive, as opposed to what is going to be the e-privacy regulation that is still in the legislative phase in the EU. It still hasn't passed the trilogue. We're still waiting for the council to come up with a final draft that could be subject to voting, but it seems that's not going to be the case. Even Germany, that's the newer president of the council, said, well, they tempered expectations, basically. I don't remember what they said, but expectations are tempered. That means we're not going to have any privacy regulation before next year. And we were thinking we were going to get it this year. We didn't. Next year is going to be a little more complicated. And in that, well, there's Brexit, and there's going to be more negotiations going on around this issue. And finally, the quality of information provided about cookies and identity of the controllers. We have to be very clear about who's dropping cookies, which cookies are third-party cookies, which cookies are our own cookies, and who is every actor involved in receiving information through those cookies. Now, for the cookies in practice, based on guidance, what we can say is that, well, this sweep report, after it was issued, it was distributed to controllers, not just the controllers that were part of the survey or the sweep, but controllers in general. It's widely available on the DPC's website. It's publicly available. You can download the report, and you can download the guidelines that are based on the findings that came out of the report. The DPC even produced a podcast where you can see hear some highlights concerning the outcomes of the sweep. Then there is a new team within the Special Investigations Unit that's actively examining the practices of new controllers across every sector on a daily basis. So cookies has been a matter of enforcement from several different regulators across Europe, and it's picking up fast. And I was telling Fergal at the beginning, before you all joined, that well, it all happened quite fast, from not caring about cookies or just giving a notice about we use cookies but without choice, all the way until now. We see a lot of activity from regulators and a lot of private actors and public actors getting quite concerned about cookies and their the invasiveness they can have on our privacy if we don't know what's going on. Controllers can expect enforcement action where they fail to bring their practices into compliance. As I said, the DPC did say that they plan to go after the one respondent that didn't respond, and you can expect the same if you are under the radar. So it's better to get in touch with them if you don't know how to go about certain issues. And well, needless to say that Schrems 2 may make things a little bit more complicated when we're talking about cookies. Well, just for you to have a clear timeline, it took him about 1 year and 2 months or so between the sweep, that was quite fast and quite swift, all the way to the October 5 enforcement, which is the date on which we all have to be compliant with all the recommendations provided by the Irish DPC. Some of the top enforcement priorities that we have to consider is that non-exempt cookies set without consent are unlawful and most likely will be sanctioned. There are only two exceptions, or only two types of cookies are exempted from getting consent. Those, you have the strictly necessary exception and you have the communications exception. The strictly necessary exception is, those cookies you need for your website to work the way it is meant to work. So for loading, for example, or if you're using a CMP, obviously you need to drop a cookie so that the user can consent or not consent or choose their preferences. But you cannot set a chatbot cookie set on the communications or strictly necessary exception. For example, the chatbot cookies would be by force under the consent obligation. And the other one was that the communications exemption is for those cookies that are there solely for the purpose of enabling communications. As I said, the chatbot cookies they do not fall under this category. A user has to interact with the chatbot and ask something in order for it to be considered that the user is consenting to the cookies, whatever cookies you need for the chatbot. The use of implied consent to set cookies is wrong. You shouldn't do it, and especially in Ireland, they have a quite a strict approach to it. Whereas you can find some broader exceptions for analytics cookies in France by CNIL. In Ireland, basically, you have to stick to consent, and you have to stick to the strictest way you can think of, the opt-in model. So give users choice at all times. You can let them choose to accept all of them. You can let them choose to know more, and then accept, a granular choice. But you can't take away choice from them. This only works if you give transparent and accurate information, including privacy and cookies notices. I tend to keep those separate. I think it's better to have a full privacy notice that may include the cookie notice, but you also have to have a cookie notice that is easily accessible and just has information about cookies. It has to be clear who the controller is, who the processor is, and what the responsibilities are, whether there are joint controllers, like the case of Fashion ID. So if you're using the Facebook like button, you should consider those scenarios. And any processing of personal data that follows from the setting of cookies and trackers, including the lawful basis for processing, has to be there, has to be visible. Not necessarily everything on the first layer, on the banner, because, well, it could be overwhelming for users if you show them a full screen with a banner. But you have to have a clear short banner that leads to more information behind it. And, well, you have to take special care if there's, if you're handling special categories of data, such as health trackers or health-related information gathered by cookies. How can you go about to do this? Well, you can use a CMP. Obviously, the example I'm going to give you is the example of OneTrust. At OneTrust, we have a consent and website scanning feature that helps you go all the way from knowing what your website has embedded onto it. So one of the problems with some of the controllers that were surveyed by the DPC was that they sometimes didn't know that they had some third-party tracking technologies embedded. As I said, some of them are invisible. So you don't know if, especially if you're not a programmer, you just administering the website, something you don't know, you have to scan for all trackers you may have so that you can have meaningful information in your cookie notice or in your preference center or whatever you want to, carve to give users the information they need to get. You have to classify all cookies. Another problem with the findings of the DPC was that, well, some of the actors were interpreting the strictly necessary category in quite a broad manner, and that's not the case. You have to stick to what the law says, and if you're in doubt, then it shouldn't be strictly necessary. That means, and those are the only cookies that can be toggled in, can be opted in by default, and you can't opt out because otherwise the website wouldn't work. Once you have your cookie categories and you know what tracking technologies you have besides the cookies, then you can have a banner and a preference center where you describe in more detail to users what they will find and perhaps even give granular choice. So you can not just accept all cookies, but you can tell them to accept by category of cookies. So they can accept the analytics cookies, but not the targeting cookies, for example. And finally, you must have an auto-blocking feature for your cookies so that no cookies are deployed before the user has consented, which was another problem found by the DPC. And that's been something that's been endemic across Europe, basically. And, well, obviously, with this in mind, once you have your banners, once you have your cookie notice, and once you have all the information you need, that information has to be dynamic because, well, especially in the digital ecosystem, things change quite fast and quite a lot. So the more technologies you include or the more vendors you include in your ecosystem that are using tracking technologies on your website would mean that you need to update your cookie notice as often as that happens. So that could be performed manually, or that could be sort of automated using software like the software we produce. And finally, once you have set up all that, well, you get ongoing monitoring and reports of what's going on, to have alerts to changes on the website, schedule regular scans so that we know if there are new technologies by any chance, and you still keep a granular way of consenting. This obviously gives you takes some of the strain of your workload if automatically you're reminding users every 6 months that, well, you have consented to these categories or these cookies. you have to do it again, or we're just reminding you that you can't withdraw your consent. And well, what it looks like when you have scanned your site, something like this, you have 53 tracking technologies as per this screenshot that I have. Sorry, I don't know why it went back. Oh, sorry. So you have 53 tracking technologies, out of which 44 are cookies, out of which, you know, a few, maybe a quarter of those are targeting cookies. So that means for advertising. The rest are strictly necessary or performance or analytics or just unknown types of cookies, which there are some unknown types of cookies. You also have tags, JavaScript, images, objects, embedded iframes, etc. And this is how it's presented to you when you use something to automate your processes for cookie compliance. You also need to have some type of configurable geolocation. Let's remember that, well, in the digital age, when we target users, most likely we're not only targeting users in the country where we are established. So if I'm in Ireland, I may be tracking and targeting users in California, which would mean that I need to understand which users are from California so that I can show them the CCPA banner instead of the EU or the DPC type of banner with the information they require, which means changing the terminology, changing some of the settings. CCPA would allow everything to be opted in by default because it's an opt-out model as opposed to the EU. Whereas in LATAM, you can drop all cookies, show cookie notice, and you have to have an action on notice. That means the user should be able to choose something, but it's not as strict as it is in Europe. And finally, you have APAC consent, where you can drop only the strictly necessary cookies. You have to show a cookie notice. You need affirmative action by the user. That means saying, yes, I accept the cookies. And you need to drop the rest of the cookies only after they consented, much like in Europe. You need to use dynamic language. You need to use a compliant consent model. You can't just, by having a CMP, you're not compliant by default. You have to make sure that your CMP, whoever is providing it, or even if it's your own, in-house CMP, you need to comply with the settings depending on the region that you're targeting with your websites, the users that you're targeting. And including within Europe, you can find some slight differences between what CNIL says in France versus what the ICO says and what the DPC has said recently in Spain. So you really can play a little bit with that, and you can tweak some of the settings, and you can play a little bit around that if cookies are part of your business model, let's say. And for the Irish DPC cookies fast track, we have pre-configured templates with banners and preference centers and descriptions that you can seamlessly embed onto your website. We have a same-day environment setup, quick start documentation, and live webinars and support like this one, where we go through every development that may be relevant to the industry. And I again want to remind you of our very powerful data guidance division. That's our intelligence division with over 50 analysts that are producing news, research notes, and anything around the world of privacy on a daily basis, which is it's quite useful, especially when the landscape changes as much as it does with cookies. This was the DPC's report findings and sweep in a crunch. I hope it was clear. Fergal, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ephraim. Thank you very much for that. So, what we have some questions in from the audience. So, what I'm actually just going to do is going to maybe run through a couple of those questions and then lead into our discussion. And then, of course, if people have more questions as we proceed, just pop them up, and we will do what we can to actually get to them. So the question here, just to start us off, just about categorization, and the idea seems to be that can we have two categories, one with essential cookies and one with a non-essential? So this is the idea that do we need to divide things into statistical and marketing and so on, or can we just have basically essential and non-essential? So that's the first question.
Well, that's a good question. There is no law saying these are the 4 categories of cookies. It is widely used among the industry actors to have 4 categories: strictly necessary, performance, analytics, and targeting. That being said, I don't see why not you couldn't have the the strictly necessary and the non-essential cookies. However, you will have to be careful that you're very transparent with your cookie notice, and that even if you have that. So that's I can understand that question. So it is more user friendly to only have that. Well, if I'm choosing if I have granular choice, yeah, I'm just going to go for the non-essential cookies, and I can just toggle off instead of going through 4 different categories. But you have to be very clear what those non-essential cookies are, whether it's only cookies or whether you have something else, what they do, and how can you withdraw your consent if you ever gave consent to non-essential cookies. But okay, it is possible, and the law doesn't prevent us from doing that, but I would recommend against it. Even if maybe on the banner you have it that way, but then when you go to the preference center where I can get more information, more granular choice, it would not be advisable. Even if you want to take advantage of the cookies, the more options you give them, the more likely it is that a user will toggle off one but not the others. For example, I would toggle off maybe targeting but not analytics.
Yeah, it seems to be all about kind of just good communication, doesn't it? Really giving people as much information and as much choice as possible. So maybe people just need to be focusing on and just kind of thinking of it from the user perspective there, and what how can I make their kind of job as easy as possible and get them as informed as possible.
That's correct. Yeah.
That's brilliant. So, and then I've another question that relates to one of the topics you brought up in your presentation, which is to do with the expiry dates, or the length of time cookies actually should persist from. And it seems to be that a lot of people looking at the DPC guidance, that the DPC guidance isn't particularly kind of clear. So I have a question here. It's not clear in the legislation or in the guidance that the expiry date is 6 months as a default, except for exceptional circumstances. And then what kind of situations would require a longer time frame? So it seems there's a lot of kind of there's kind of ambiguity there. There's kind of discretion, but people are kind of wondering what is the level of discretion, and what's what can we really do here?
I think one key aspect of this is that you have to get yourself in the shoes of the user. So what does the user expect? If I have consented to a website that says I visit on a regular basis every day, data guidance, right? And I've accepted cookies, I don't want that website to ask me every day if I consent. And I see some websites doing that. For example, The Guardian, right? I get asked every time, and I think to myself, well, why don't they just set a 1-year lifespan, and perhaps they remind me in 6 months? So there is no clear guidance, and it will change from country to country. I advise, and it's not advice, but what I would do is I wouldn't set anything longer than a year, because what's the point of setting anything for longer than a year, especially for websites, unless it's a very specific website that will be there for 5 years, and we know will be there for 5 years, has a very specific function with a very specific set of people using it. Well, yeah, maybe okay. But if it's a publicly available website that could be accessed from anywhere, then say, what's the point? You don't want to have persistent cookies that last only 1 second, because you don't want to overwhelm users with questions. But at the same time, you don't want to have anything that lasts longer than a year, because users may forget, and that's how data leaks happen. When you start visiting a website, you forget it exists. Nevertheless, that website still has your information. There is a persistent cookie that's still on your linked to your machine that's may be active or even dormant. But if you go again, it's funneled all that information about all the things you've done, and it's going to pass it on anyway. So I don't see why you would keep anything longer than a year. And if you do keep something for up to a year, I'd say every 6 months, remind the user, hey, by the way, you consented to our cookies 6 months ago. Do you want to check it back again just to see if you're still okay with it?
Perfect. Yeah. No, absolutely. So it seems like the essence here is, and I think your idea, kind of put yourself in the place of the user and ask what they would think is reasonable, and if we're doing that, we're probably going to stay on the right side of the right side of this guidance. Now, actually, on the guidance, I have another question that kind of relates to it. And it's actually something that I've heard quite a lot of this from my customers. And there's a section in the guidance that talks about about nudging users toward accepting cookies. And then of course there seems to be a lot of latitude in terms of like what or a lot of possibility in terms of what that nudge might be. Now, a lot of people are doing kind of, things like subtle things like color coding a slightly brighter, accept all button, or they're doing like kind of, recessed buttons for the for the reject and so on. Is that the sort of stuff that's going to cause trouble for people? Is it all a little bit kind of disingenuous, or is and how kind of, how seriously are the DPC kind of thinking about this nudge? Were they just thinking about these really extreme cases with like enormous accept all buttons and reject buttons you kind of have to search for somewhere on the side? So that's another question we have. I think
they are. I mean, yeah. Obviously, by using the word nudging, we're using it. It's not a vague word, but it becomes vague when we put it on this setting, right? So obviously, we can't know unless we get in the hands of the regulators, right, or of the current commissioner in Ireland or the current commissioner in the UK, how they understand nudging. But I think that they were focused on the ridiculous cases, like having only one button that says accept and nothing else. That's the most kind of rough way of nudging someone. Well, you have to accept because that's all you can. Yeah. Color coding, well, I would say it's fine. I've seen it around, also with public organizations. But let's say, well, you have one green button, one blue button, but none of them is brighter than the other, right? So you can color code, obviously, or you can have one on top of the other, or you can have, well, I accept all cookies, or I want to customize my settings. That's a bit of nudging because, well, accept versus knowing more or customizing settings. I'm gonna accept all because I'm in a rush and I want to get on the website. Mm-hmm. That's still acceptable, right? But what wouldn't be acceptable would be to have a button for accepting cookies that works versus a button for customizing settings or reject that doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that does seem fair, doesn't it? Because obviously, there's so much subtlety in user experience anyway, and the idea that someone could kind of look at this and argue objectively that this, that just making things a little bit better is influencing, so it does seem to be about these more broad-based, and that makes a lot of sense. There's another question that we have here is kind of it relates to kind of an extreme approach, and they're basically asking. They've seen companies go down the road of the kind of zero tracking, and this kind of and what they say is this seems to solve a lot of problems for users. It's kind of quite user friendly. And do you see a lot of people going down that zero tracking route? So that's just a query we have in.
You mean users, or you mean?
Or sorry, companies. Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, companies going down that zero. So basically, just stopping using cookies altogether.
I mean, I haven't seen that happening, at least, my personal experience. But if you're not monetizing with third-party data, if you're not monetizing from your cookies, that is a good idea. And that is a good solution because you don't have to worry about it anymore. Provided you will always have some sort of cookie or some sort of technology that may track you because it's strictly necessary and there's nothing you can do about it. But you just have to be clear about it, and that's it. There's nothing else you can do. And I think you can find examples, especially from the European Commission website. So go to the EDPB website or the European Data Protection Supervisor's website, and they are very, they don't have too much information because they don't track people, because they don't monetize with those data. And I think that's the most privacy-centric banner that I've seen, whereby you have one accept all button, one reject all button, and one customize my settings button. So you can choose. You can choose. When you go to customize my settings, well, I think the only thing you can toggle on is the analytics or the performance and they don't track for advertising. So there's no individualization, no singling out of users. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. May happen with the phasing out of third-party cookies, but yeah, so far I haven't seen people just asking if they can simply bluntly not track.
Well, I think a lot of people, like it does seem like an extreme position. I think, a lot of people are, it would be hard to see the motivation. Anybody, the information that you can gather using cookies are useful to most organizations, and it's hard to really see the advantages of not even attempting to attempting. And of course, I think the general thing here as well is that tracking isn't bad in itself. It's how it's used, and it's about people being informed and so on. And I think that's, you know, I think, and I don't think anybody wants to suggest here that we should actually give up various forms of tracking entirely. But actually, this question about the, you know, and this is something that we, you know, that we had planned and discussing, and it's something that's of great interest to our customers, is really about the future of cookies. You know, this idea with the you know, the major browsers are going to be phasing out support for third-party cookies and so on. And there seems to be a kind of this a pretty large kind of paradigm shift with respect to cookies and tracking occurring and so on. So people are kind of wondering what digital marketing is going to look like, you know, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and so on. And that does seem like that major changes are afoot.
No, definitely. I mean, this all started. So I don't think this is something new. It's new that we know about it, or that we are more aware about it. But that's something that had been happening for a while with you know, smaller browsers. So Safari, for example, Explorer, they stopped using, or they limited the use. It's a better word. They started limiting the use of third-party cookies a while ago, a year or two ago, and this, I think, responds to a shift in the web from, so we had Web 1.0, which was publication logic, I think. Then you have Web 2.0, which is interaction logic or communication logic with the user, and then you have Web 3.0, which is privacy logic, where users are more aware of the importance of their privacy, and they want to regain control. So browsers knew that, and Google was the last one to come into this, to jump in on this model. The problem is that the Chrome has about 70% of the market share for third-party cookies, whereas the other browsers, you know, have from 2% to I don't know, to 10 or 15%. So it definitely is a game changer. They have announced this phasing out will start in October, by limiting the use and the abilities of third-party cookies, and will end in October 2022. So it's going to be 2 years of changing the model that will give them leeway for developing a new type of technology to track users' interests instead of individual users. And when that will be active, if it's 2022, it will be active on Chrome. But I don't know what features the other browsers will start to look into, or whether they will develop something similar. In the case of Google, for example, which is the most known, you have what they call the privacy sandbox, Google Privacy Sandbox, whereby they designed or are designing 7 different elements for the sandbox that work on a less individualistic manner. So instead of singling out individual users, you group people by interests. So they start using interest groups and following users. Obviously, there is always a way for re-identifying the users, especially if you start mixing and matching what you get, what information you get from this technology. But in essence, what they want to do is stick that to a privacy budget. So let's say you want to embed certain cookies onto users' platform, computer or browser, because he wants to play a video, right, or a song or something. Those cookies would be heavier than strictly necessary cookies. Therefore, you're reducing your privacy budget, and when you are done with it, when you've ended your privacy budget, you would need to ask the user if they agree for them to keep funneling information, and if they don't, they still, I think, by law, they wouldn't be able to block the content on the website. They would just so that's one of the main features and one of the main elements of the privacy sandbox. And they also have this. So this is to avoid fingerprinting, and it's to be used in combination with interest groups, what they call flock and piggings. It's federated learning of cohorts, and then you have the pigging, which is not really singling out and funneling information to all these ad tech vendors about individual users, but these are the interest groups, and you will only target people in groups instead of targeting individually. But I'm not really sure still how this is going to work. They're still making changes to that. The information I got from the privacy sandbox is quite recent. It's all new, so I think we still have to wait and see.
Yeah.
but the industry is playing a big role in changing the landscape. Like you have that on the one hand, but at the same time, forget about browsers. You have in Germany, I don't know if you guys know this magazine, Der Spiegel in Germany. If you go onto their website now, they give you a choice between paying with your data for content or paying with cash. So if you want access, you either cache the data. I'm not sure. To me, that's a little problematic, right? Especially if you look at the law. But well, that could very well be that this is where we're heading. Well, you know, we're ever more learning the value of our information and how much do you value my information? How much do you want to get it? What will you give me in return? But well, we still have to wait and see what this is going to change. I think in 6 months' time, we will be having a very different conversation from the one we're having right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, you know, one thing that's kind of very, very clear is that this is a complex area and it's a constantly evolving area. And, you know, that's what I often tend to say to our customers are that, you know, that compliance kind of can feel like hard and it feels kind of like an obstacle now. But who knows really what the future is going to bring? And I think it's like that we can all kind of play a role in kind of contributing to this kind of discussion and figuring out ways. But I think the principles here are, you know, that respect to the user and putting that really at the heart of what we're doing and figuring out what's best for all of us. So it absolutely, so it's a fascinating area. Now I'm aware of us running out of time here. I just want to get in just one last question because I think now I'm not getting to everybody's questions and I apologize for that, but I'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to get this question because it does keep coming up. You spoke about non-exempt cookies without consent being non-compliant, but with two exceptions. And can you explain the exceptions again? So the necessary cookies and then the communication exception. So this communication exception, I think, it gets people confused a little bit. And sorry for bringing up such a technical question at the last minute.
No worries. In fact, I'm gonna bring some up in case I need. Yeah, I understand it's confusing. So that exception comes from the e-privacy directive as well. So the only way in which you can deploy tracking technologies is if the sole purpose of that technology is to enable the transmission of communications, right? So let me think. And then the problem is that I didn't bring any examples of. I should have. I thought about. No, it's too technical. Maybe not. I should have brought examples about this, but hang on. I'm sure I have something around here. But so the gist of it is that if your cookie or your tracking technology's sole purpose is to enable the transmission, for example, the transmission of communications would be your website loading onto your screen, right? Because my computer is communicating with your server, right? So if that cookie, what it does is enabling your server to send and load that website on my computer, that cookie would be exempted. If your cookie enables a chatbot, that is not exempted. That you have to accept it, for example, by actively opening the chatbot and typing a question into the chatbot. That obviously is, I am consenting, but there should be some information. Well, yes, a chatbot uses cookies, but that's not the type of communication the law means. The law means communication as in packets, if we can think of packets, you know, electric signals. So
it was a way to put it is the difference between opening the channel and then putting something down the channel. So if you need to use a cookie to, as it were, open the channel and keep it open, then that's okay. But once you actually put anything down the channel, like for example, you know, data, an app, and so on, then that's obviously not that's not. So it's basically get the road in place, but no cars on it. Effectively, is that helpful?
Exactly, I think so. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense to me, and especially if you think of SDKs. So SDKs are what apps do, mobile apps instead of cookies. It's exactly the same, but you know that's exactly what they do more so than cookies. Any app you want on your phone, in order for it to work, it has to be exchanging information. And most of them are not enabling communications between you and the app developers or another server. There's just information they need for the app to run properly. But maybe because, well, I'm using the walker tracker, for example. Well, the app needs to know how much I walk and needs to know how active I am. but that doesn't mean it's enabling communications. The only thing enabling communications is the one SDK that activates this channel between my mobile and their server.
No, that's very useful, and I think this is something like that will be coming up for us again and again, because it is one of those areas that people will have to figure their way through. Okay, so I'm going to have to wrap up, which is a pity, because I think, you know, we had a bunch of questions we haven't got to, and there's a whole lot of stuff that Frayne and I wanted to discuss that we haven't got around to, but that's the way things go. But let me just finish off with a few things. We are recording this, so we're going to be making this available ASAP, and we'll be in touch with anybody who's registered because of that. If people have further questions or the question that we didn't answer, we'll get around to those. So just keep sending anything else in, and we'll get you we'll get you a view back on those. And just apologies to anybody whose questions that I didn't get to. So it remains to thank everybody, all the attendees. So really appreciate you spending this hour with us. Thank you to the team of OneTrust. Thank you to Frayne for his wonderful presentation, and for handling a load of questions that I just kind of fired at him just there. So you know, thank you very much for that, and thank you to the team at Arekibo and so on, and everybody who's been involved in getting this together. Goodbye, and have a nice remainder of the morning and afternoon. Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Fergal.